Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome back. We are finally in Theology Thursday up to chapter 6, the final chapter of Ephesians. It's a good, very thorough, as we've said before, very thorough look at Ephesians. So we've been looking at, in the last chapter, we finished last week by talking about the relationship between husbands and wives and how everybody submits to each other.
Employers and employees.
Yeah, so this time it's about children.
Yep.
And parents and employers and employees, or slaves and slave owners. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So,
Okay, let's read the first few verses. So
Chapter 6.
Children, be obedient to your parents, because being in Christ, it's the right thing to do. Honour both your father and your mother. It's the first commandment with a promise attached to it. And that promise is that things will work out well for you and you may have a long life on the earth. Fathers, don't humiliate or abuse your children. That will only make them angry. Instead, discipline them fairly and teach them the ways of the Lord. Servants, obey those who are your earthly masters. Show them respect and honour, and do so sincerely. Obey them as you would obey Christ, and not just while they're watching, but because you are really the servants of Christ. Serve with a whole heart, knowing that you are doing the will of God. Serve enthusiastically, as though you were serving God and not just men, because you know that the Lord will reward each for the good things that they do, whether they're slave or free. And masters, the same applies to you. Don't use threats or abuse, because you know that the one who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and he will treat everyone equally, regardless of their earthly status.
Alrighty. So let's talk about that context a little.
Yeah, we spoke last time about the importance of context. And these verses are a continuation of the context of Paul's teaching that we are in the world, but not of the world. We're supposed to be positively different than the world.
Right.
He taught about Christian conduct towards one another in the church, and then turned his attention to the home.
Right.
In this new kingdom, the church, all of us are to submit to one another in love so that we can create unity.
Right.
Wives have to submit to their husbands, and husbands have to love their wives. In this kingdom, wives are not the property of their husbands. They are to be treated with respect and love. This kind of mutual submission and love, they were revolutionary concepts at the time that Paul wrote them. So now Paul comes to address the place of children, and he makes it clear that not only were wives to be treated well, but children were to be treated well also. But children also needed to play their role. They need to be obedient and show respect and honour towards their parents.
Right.
So, of course, expecting children to be obedient to parents was hardly rocket science. It's not something new. In fact, in Paul's day, if parents didn't like the way their children behaved, they could beat them thoroughly and even kill them.
Really?
Even kill them.
That must have been rare, surely. But
in the Old Testament, you know, if a kid wouldn't behave, ultimately they were to be taken to the gate and given to the elders and said, "This kid's unruly," and they'd stone him.
What?
So,
thank goodness those days are behind us.
But Paul says that the obedience of children towards parents is an integral part of the order that is evident in the new kingdom. And he gives some basic reasons, 4 basic reasons in fact. Firstly, children are to obey their parents as a way of obeying God. Paul told the church in Colossae that children should obey their parents because this pleases the Lord.
Well, it's one of the 10 Commandments, isn't it, Dave?
That's true.
So number 5?
Something like that.
Yeah, I think it's number 5.
The second reason is that simply it's the right thing to do.
Right.
One of the primary foundations of a society is the strength of the family unit. And in such a unit, children are properly submitted to their parents and give honour and respect. That's part of the way that it works. Regardless of the culture of the society, it's an instinctively known reality.
And it's true that in many cultures today, it's stronger.
Yep.
In certain cultures, kids are much more respectful of their parents. Certainly in Western culture, at least in America, Australia, kids are less and less respectful of their parents, it would seem, than they are in some other cultures.
And that's a problem in society, because it's not only disrespectful to parents, but that carries out right through into society, and they're disrespectful to all authority.
Right.
And it's in that context of obedience that children learn and are nurtured and are cared for. Thirdly, Paul says obedience of children is a command of the Lord. It's, as you said, one of the big 10. If we are to obey the Lord, then obedience to parents is part of the deal.
Yeah.
Fourth, obedience to parents comes with a promise. None of the other commandments did.
Right.
But this one did.
Yeah.
By the way, the idea of honouring parents actually doesn't have an expiry date. Regardless of our age, we are still to honour parents.
Right.
To honour and respect them. That's something that we should do as a matter of course.
Maybe that's linked with that promise. Jesus in the Ten Commandments says, "Honor your mother, for then you will live long in the land."
Yep.
So you live long, so then you get to enjoy that same respect from your kids for even longer.
But this is not a standalone statement, for there's another side. Fathers are not to provoke their children.
Yeah.
The word that's generally translated provoke in a lot of in fact most translations, it's a Greek word that means to exasperate or enrage. In Paul's day, fathers often used abuse and humiliation as tools to bring children into subservience, and this would make their life unbearable, and sometimes it would lead to children becoming angry and distant from their father. And Paul says that they were to be citizens of this new kingdom, and thus they needed to be respected and treated fairly. I think that we sometimes lose sight of that. One of the things that I hear in the church, not this church fortunately, but I often have heard in the church is, we've got to invest in the kids, they are the next generation. No, they're not. They're this generation.
They are now, right? Yeah.
And they're part of the kingdom just as we are. And they have a standing before God the same actually as us. They're born again children of the living God. So in the kingdom of God, kids deserve appropriate respect as well as appropriate discipline.
And maybe if the kids aren't respecting the parents, there could be a problem with the parenting style. And he's saying, hey, make this easy on yourselves. Like parents, don't exasperate your kids. Don't give them. Don't be so harsh on them that it just makes it impossible for them to. Or don't be unreasonable. Sometimes we can be unreasonable with our children, and kids just go, that's not fair. And
but still, kids need to be disciplined.
Sure.
A child needs to be corrected and face consequences for wrongdoing. And I suggest if they don't, it's just as bad. By not disciplining them, it's just as bad as abusing them in other ways.
Yeah.
Because
Agreed,
we're fitting them, equipping them with some very bad habits that are going to backfire and cause them problems later on in their life.
It's like the Bible says, no discipline seems pleasant at the time, but we all understand once we're older that it's beneficial. Go to bed on time, do your homework, do your chores. Kids that are raised with no discipline at all, once they become adults, they have no idea what it requires. They've never mowed the lawn, or they've never washed the dishes, or they've never, hung the laundry out, or whatever. They've not done chores. They've not been, they've eaten poorly. You discipline your child to eat well, like eat your vegetables. It's good for you. And
It amazes me in the society in which we live now, how many kids, when you sit them down at a meal table, it's clear that they don't eat good food regularly because they don't know how to use a knife and fork. And some of them literally have no idea. And that really, I think that's a danger for
We used
the
to
kids.
say to our kids, all right, you're all allowed to have one thing. Choose one food that you don't like, and that's it. So choose wisely, and we won't give you that one thing. Or we would sometimes say, look, you might not like it, but you have to eat half of it. So we'd make them eat half of it. And now, of course, all of them enjoy all food and all vegetables because they were disciplined to do that. They were okay, and because nobody's going to choose broccoli instead of chocolate. All kids are going to want more chocolate, but it's not good for them. So.
That's right. So what Paul was saying was simply the children need to be treated with appropriate respect, even when discipline was administered. So discipline should be given in love and not retribution.
Right.
So you don't whack your kids when you're angry.
Yeah.
We need to discipline with love. Discipline should be fair, and the children should be instructed in God's ways. Deuteronomy tells us the children should be taught God's ways when they're seated in the home, when you're out and about in the morning and in the evening.
Yeah.
So there's a pattern there to teaching them
I
the
think
principles
too,
of God.
Absolutely, and I think that's the essence of discipline, as I've already alluded to a couple of times. Discipline isn't just about punishment. Like when you hear the word discipline, you think of in terms of, like sending them to their room, or correction, right? And that is a part of it. But there's a lot more to discipline and being a disciplined human than just being punished. It is about, exercise. It's about study. It's about, diet, nutrition. It's about sleep. It's about having a life that knows what it is to be disciplined, knows how to say no to some of the cravings that are not good for us. That's part of discipline. And parents, it's on us to teach our children that, like you said, teach your children how to pray, teach them how to turn to the Lord when something's not right, and pray about things. These are the sorts of things that you're supposed to teach your kids so that when they're old, they won't forget them.
Well, I think we've got to acknowledge the tremendous pressure that's on children today, as we see the pressures and the immorality that's pushed on children at such an early age. It's an incredibly difficult time for our kids, and more are just simply not coping. Teach them His Word. Teach them about God's love and care for them. Teach them to find their position and purpose and identity in Him, not in the fickle, changing thoughts of social media and their peers.
Yeah, well, there's a discipline for you. How much time on the screen is appropriate.
Yes.
Again, discipline your children. Show them how to be disciplined with Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, whatever it is.
Yeah. Next thing, Paul turns his attention to the master-servant relationship.
Right.
Whenever we read this passage in Ephesians 6, there is an elephant in the room that can't simply be ignored.
Slavery.
Absolutely. And in this passage, Paul does appear to condone the practice of human slavery. Well, at least he doesn't directly condemn it and demand that every Christian immediately emancipate all slaves in their household. But we've got to remember that Paul was writing in the context of a culture.
Yeah, and can I say too, there's absolutely no evidence and there's no suggestion that Paul or any of the apostles owned a slave.
No.
So, they weren't condoning it.
No.
But like you said, they're in a culture where there was slavery was common.
And I think in the context of that culture, Paul had to give instruction to Christians about how they should live and cope with that culture. The New Testament writers nowhere condone slavery, but they give some instruction about how to live in a culture that not only condoned it, but strongly practiced all forms of slavery. And that seems so abhorrent to us in Western culture.
Yeah.
Although, we've got to say, by the way, that there are more slaves today than there were at any point during Paul's lifetime.
Yeah.
And that's remarkable.
Yeah. Interestingly, in the Roman setting, slaves were often the product of a town or a country that refused to acquiesce to Rome.
Right, yep.
So if Rome comes in and says, we're taking over, and you didn't like it and you fought back, like Israel did in 70 AD,
Yeah,
when the
slave.
Romans finally destroyed Jerusalem, 1.1 million were killed, but 200,000 became slaves around the empire, because you resist Rome, this is going to be the consequence. You either become Roman citizens or you become our slaves.
I don't think that we should take Paul's command here in Ephesians 6 as justification of slavery.
No.
Rather, he's continuing to teach about, even in hard times, how to live for Christ in evil days, how to live a godly life in an ungodly world. We would love for him to have called out the system of slavery, but he didn't. He did tell Philemon to treat Onesimus as a brother, and he told slaves that if they had a chance to find their freedom, they should take it.
100%.
And in this new kingdom, the kingdom of God, not only was the stature of wives lifted and that children were treated with love and respect, but slaves also were now to be part of the church and have the same right as their masters. Many would think that was absolutely crazy at the time. Children were now told that their slaves were to be treated like brothers. It was possible that a slave might have a position or role to which the master might have to submit in the church.
Look, I mean, it's when you watch movies about slavery, you often see the chain gang, the whips, and like when they're building the pyramids or whatever, and they're cracking the whip. That's not really how it worked in this series, in this
not in this
culture.
No.
This was more, these are people that worked for you in your household.
I think indentured servants is probably a better description, but
not that makes it okay. No. And and you need to pay. That's why like when Paul says here, if you're a slave and you get option, not here but in our other letter, if you get the option to be free, well, why wouldn't you want to be free? Well, because some people say, I'm looked after. I'm fed 3 meals a day. I've got a comfortable bed. I've got my own wife and kids. We're all part of this household. And so it might be more like an unpaid servant is sort of what's more the culture that we're talking about.
So Paul was saying that...
Not that makes it okay, just pointing that out.
Paul was saying that no longer were slaves to be treated as mere property. It was no longer right to abuse them.
No.
Sure, Paul does not address the issue of whether slavery is right or wrong. It was simply the way that the society worked. In terms of the application of this to us today, we should dig out the principle and apply it to the kind of workplace that we find in the 21st century world. And we apply the principles to the employer-employee relationship that we see in today's society. To convert Paul's statement to our Western culture, we would suggest that Paul teaches Christian employers or employees to submit to their employers, and Christian employers should be good to their staff and treat them with dignity and fairness. Paul uses the same word, obey, in relation to both children and servants. Christians are required to give their employers the same respect as they want their children to give them.
Right.
And that's a big ask. Paul says that Christians should be, they should not just work while they're being watched, but they should work consistently as though they were working for God, because there is, of course, one who is always watching.
Right.
I think it was Moody that said character is what you are in the dark, or what you do in the dark.
And that's the important point here. If you work for somebody, or if you're the boss of somebody, the why behind the what is God is watching.
Yes.
God is watching. So if you're an employee, God is watching. He's saying you could impact the people around you the way you work. If you're slack and you only work hard when, oh, here he comes, look busy. If you only do it, what message is that sending to your boss? What message is that sending to your fellow employees? It's saying you're slack, and that you got to have a positive attitude and go, you know what, I love this, and give 100%. Likewise, if you're an employer and you are not kind to your employees, what is God thinking? God's saying you could be impacting their lives.
Yep.
You're my ambassador, whether you work for somebody or whether you're the boss. You're my ambassador, so act like it.
Yep.
Represent me well, says the Lord.
It doesn't matter who you are or what position you hold. Unlike men, God shows no favoritism, no partiality. He's not impressed by worldly wealth, position, status, power. That is not what he's looking for.
No.
But he is looking. Paul reminding the slave owners that they should treat their slaves well, because God watches both the earthly masters and the earthly slaves equally, and they stand equal before God. What impresses God is the character of each. The reality is that whether you have the most menial job or the highest paying executive role, it doesn't matter to God, and in that sense shouldn't matter to us. We should work until as though we were working for the Lord. Even though your employer might not appreciate you, the Lord does, and he will ultimately honour you for your Christ-like work ethic. As a Christian, the Lord requires employers to display the same sort of work ethic. A Christian employer should treat their employees with respect and appreciation, should pay them an appropriate and fair wage, and above all, the Christian employer is expected to keep their word and promises and treat all employees equally, because there is no partiality with the Lord.
Yeah, I would even suggest, you pray about, if you are a boss, pray about not just paying the bare minimum. There's the minimum wage here in Australia, and maybe whatever country you're in, there might be a minimum wage. But I think we're called to be, to rise above the minimum standards, and if we look after our people, the people that work for us, that's sending a great sign to them. We serve a God who is generous. We serve a God of abundance, the God who gives more than enough, the 12 basketfuls left over. So we should try to act like that. But also, if we're an employee, we should go the extra mile, like that Jesus says, if they ask you to walk 1 mile, go 2, go do a bit extra. Don't be so legalistic. That doesn't mean you don't get paid overtime. I get it. You should, you're what is it, a good day's pay for a good day's work. But it means bringing an attitude where your boss just goes, oh, I'm so glad that person works for me. I'm so grateful for that person. They've just, they really bring something to the team. So just consider that. We want to be Christians who represent the Lord really well. And that's the bottom line in what Paul is saying here. Whether you're a child or a parent, whether you're an employee or an employer, represent Jesus well. God bless you. And we'll see you next Thursday as we do the next section of chapter 6. God bless.